Hey guys, today we are going to talk about Microsoft Surface Pro X versus Apple iPad Pro. Which premium tablet is the best? Okay, so let's begin. Microsoft's recently unveiled Surface Pro X is shaping up to be the best Surface device for people that are always on the move, especially since it can easily pack its pen into its keyboard and it has crazy 13-hour battery life. But how does that compare to Apple's iPad Pro, which has been the #1 tablet, detachable for most business users and creatives? We got hands-on with the Surface Pro X before its official launch on November 6, and since we've already reviewed the iPad Pro, we've decided to break down the major differences. Here's our first look at how these two premium machines stack up. Now we move to the topic: differences in design. The Surface Pro X and iPad Pro are roughly the same size. But the iPad Pro still looks more like a regular tablet, while the Surface Pro X is a proper detachable. There are a few major differences in the design to distinguish them. Firstly, the Surface Pro X has a built-in kickstand to hold itself up, while the iPad Pro relies on separately purchased keyboard to do so. Secondly, the iPad Pro magnetically charges its stylus when it's placed on the side of it. And the Surface Pro X's stylus embeds itself within the optional Surface Pro X signature keyboard, sold separately as a $270 bundle with the pen. While Microsoft's solution is neater, you still need to buy the keyboard to take advantage of it. The iPad Pro does have more options when it comes to color, as it's available in silver and space gray. The Surface Pro X is available only matte black. Now talk about ports. While both the Surface Pro X and iPad Pro sport a similarly slim footprint, the Surface Pro X has the advantage of ports. The Surface Pro X sports two USB Type-C ports, a Surface Connect port and a Nano SIM card slot. Meanwhile, the iPad Pro has only one USB Type-C port and a Nano SIM card slot. The Surface Pro X's 13-inch screen and the iPad Pro's 12.9-inch display are equally sharp, at 2880 by 1920 and 2732 by 2048, respectively. We didn't get to spring out our colorimeter at Microsoft's event, but we do know how colorful and bright the iPad Pro is. Its panel reproduced 128.4% of the sRGB color gamut and emitted 484 nits of brightness. The Surface Pro X's screen was plenty bright and colorful in person, but if it's anything like the Surface Pro 6, then it'll beat the iPad on color 136% but lose on brightness 408 nits. A significant advantage that the iPad Pro has is that its screen is clocked at a 120 Hz refresh rate, whereas the Surface Pro X's screen will likely be capped at 60 Hz. Let's talk about keyboard and stylus. It's hard to say which stylus takes the cake with only a few moments of testing, but choosing the better keyboard couldn't be easier. With the few minutes we spent with the Surface Pro X's detachable keyboard, our impressions of its typing experience were favorable. The keys offered a decent amount of travel and they had a nice weightiness to them. Meanwhile, we find the iPad Pro's keyboard to be a bit too shallow for comfort. Let's talk about the performance. Coincidentally, the Surface Pro X and the iPad Pro both rock proprietary processors, with the Pro X packing a Microsoft SQ1 CPU and the iPad Pro boasting the A12X Bionic chip. According to Microsoft, the SQ1 offers 3 times the performance per watt as the Surface Pro 6. Meanwhile, the iPad Pro's A12X Bionic chip scored a blazing 17,995 on the Geekbench 4 overall performance test, which is significantly better than the Surface Pro 6's 8th Gen Core i5 CPU 13,025. The iPad Pro absolutely killed it on an Adobe Rush video editing benchmark, transcoding a 4K video to 1080p in just 7 minutes and 47 seconds, whereas the Surface Pro 6 took 31 to 54. The Surface Pro X's Microsoft SQ1 CPU needs to be an absolute beast in order to compete with the iPad Pro's A12X Bionic chip. Battery life on both systems are surprisingly neck and neck, at least based on Microsoft's claims. The iPad Pro lasted an incredibly strong 13 hours of 14 minutes on our battery test, which forces a system to continuously surf the web over Wi-Fi at 150 nits of brightness. That's a smidge better than the 13 hours of battery that the Surface Pro X is rated for, so we look forward to testing Microsoft's new system in our labs. Both the iPad Pro and Surface Pro X can get incredibly exorbitant in terms of cost. Both systems start at $999. For that price, the Surface Pro X packs 8 GB of RAM and a 128 GB SSD, which is better than the starting 12.9-inch iPad Pro's 4 GB of RAM and 64 GB of storage. You'll have to pay extra for accessories, but the Surface Pro X's are a tiny bit cheaper. The Surface's add-ons cost $139 for the Signature keyboard and $144 for the Slim, while the iPad Pro's keyboard and Apple Pencil cost an extra $199 and $129, respectively. Upgrading the storage to a 256 GB SSD on the Surface Pro X will cost you an additional $300, which is pretty nuts. The jump from 64 GB to 256 GB on the iPad is half the price, costing an additional $150 more. However, adding LTE costs an additional $250. The maxed-out model for the Surface Pro X costs $1,799 and comes with 16 GB of RAM and a 512 GB SSD, $2,084 with accessories. The iPad Pro that we tested came with 1 TB of storage and LTE connectivity, which cost $1,899. Putting the accessories on top of that brings the total to $2,227. From the cost of adding accessories alone, it's clear that the iPad and the Surface aren't winning any awards on value. We think that you have got a clear view between Microsoft Surface Pro X and Apple iPad Pro. Thanks for watching, subscribe us and press the bell button to get our instant updates.